This lecture is about the concept of AI safety, which focuses primarily on the existential risk potentially posed by artificial intelligence. In 2023, a statement was issued reading in its entirety, mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority, alongside other societal scale risks such as pandemics and nuclear war. This statement was signed by hundreds of leading figures in many different fields. University researchers at Berkeley, Stanford, Toronto, Tsinghua, Oxford, and MIT, leaders of AI research at OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, members of US Congress, the British House of Lords, the Digital Minister of Taiwan, and leaders in fields dealing with many other risks than AI, such as the climate change activist Bill McKibben, and the legal scholar Lawrence Tribe, and the security expert Bruce Schneier. What does this statement mean, and why did they issue it? The central motivating worry is this. AI might potentially someday be agential. I'll talk more about this later, but by an agent, here we mean an entity that is capable of taking independent action in the world. Second, agential AI might have a value system that is partially aligned with that of humans, but not fully aligned. The idea is that agents operate according to a value system. It might be one that is programmed in, one that is developed by evolution, one that is learned, or whatever. Finally, AI might someday have abilities of planning, reasoning, and acting in the world that are radically different from those of humans and perhaps much greater. This is the possibility of general intelligence. The basic worry is that in a world with both humans and powerful misaligned AIs, the AIs would sometimes be doing things that humans like, but often doing things that are deeply problematic for humans. I think the best way to understand the structure of this worry is by thinking about corporations. Just like AIs, corporations are agential entities with a value system, in particular the profit motive, that is partially aligned with human values. Corporations make profit by selling things to humans that humans want, but it's not fully aligned. And corporations have powers of interaction with the world that no individual human has. And we know from the history and also the present of corporations that they sometimes get out of control and cause damage in the pursuit of unchecked profits. So, for instance, early corporations like the British East India Company were founded to solve a problem. There was a specific project bringing spices back from around the world to Europe that worked much better if it was done with resources that were beyond those of any individual. So they got together and founded a corporation which had more resources than any one person. The initial investors were able to profit by finding ways to provide large shipments of spices to households around Europe. And eventually they started bringing manufactured goods to India as well. Once the corporation was created and making a steady profit from sale of spices and sale of manufactured goods, they started getting involved in more and more activities to ensure that the profits kept flowing. Eventually, it became much more like an unelected government of large parts of the world. At first, there were dozens of investors and hundreds of crew members on the ships. But by the peak of the British East India Company, there were hundreds of ships, thousands of administrators, security forces and armies of tens of thousands, and no individual really in charge, just various directors and administrators subject to a board of shareholders who had no particular interest in common besides profit. Corporations, of course, have not led to human extinction, but their misaligned motives have often resulted in problems. Although corporations only profit when they can sell things to humans, and thus only when they can do something that humans want, they often try to do so in ways that look superficially like what humans want, but are actually some cheaper and easier alternative. We're probably all somewhat familiar with the hundreds of years of corporate activity since then that has both provided food and shelter and clothing and entertainment to billions of people, but also cut corners on safety, crushed the dreams of workers, polluted the atmosphere, and covered up health risks that were discovered along the way. It wasn't until the middle of the 20th century that the colonial project begun by the East India Company was finally ended, due to a mass movement of hundreds of millions of people living in what is now India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. No individual was able to stop the corporation. It was far beyond that. What was needed was a mass movement of people involved in setting up major democratic governments. To the extent that the governments of these countries have been democratic, they have provided ways to amplify the interests of humans. But to the extent that the governments have been controlled by special interests, such as profit or military power or some specific ideological value, governments can sometimes also have the same sorts of misaligned values as corporations. And the AI safety movement is trying to get ahead of this same set of concerns for AI rather than for corporations and government. Thinking about possible future agential AIs along the lines of corporations or ideological governments is a good reason to worry about them. But why should we treat this as an existential threat that might result in human extinction? Well, we should think about the extinctions of other species that have happened. There are thousands and thousands of species that humans have driven to extinction in a variety of ways, many of which we aren't even aware of. Some of them are ones that we hunted for food until they went extinct, and some of them were pests that we intentionally eliminated. But there have also been many species that we killed just incidentally. I'll give two examples here. The baiji was a dolphin that used to live in the Yangtze River in China, but it was gradually driven to extinction as more of the river was used for agricultural and industrial purposes. Even though the people of the area liked the dolphin and had positive stories about it, the natural human interest in food and electricity and industrial development ended up leaving no room for it to live. The Carolina parakeet was a parrot species that used to live in the southeastern United States up until the early 20th century. It was a pretty bird that people appreciated, and its range was starting to shrink in the late 19th century as logging and farming spread throughout the United States. But the final blow seems to have been a disease that spread from domesticated poultry to these birds. In both of these cases, humans never intentionally tried to eliminate these species, but it happened as a byproduct of things people did want. If, in the future, AI is powerful enough to make major modifications of the environment to serve whatever goals it is aiming for, then there's a reasonable worry that they might make changes to the atmosphere or the environment or our food systems or to the global mix of pathogens or whatever that might incidentally have the side effect of eliminating us, just as we have done to various other species. The thought experiment that has somehow become the standard example here is one in which someone has developed an AI system to ensure that there's sufficient office supplies available. Just as corporate profit might initially be aligned with supplying something that humans want, like the transport of spices and manufactured goods, but then can start going overboard as it seeks more and more profit without concern for human values directly, the same might happen with this office supply AI. At first, it's just a bit of an oversupply of office products. But if it has the ability to not just purchase paper clips, but also set up factories and mines and things like that, it could get worse. Because it doesn't care about any other human values, it ends up digging huge new mines for iron, bulldozing large amounts of human habitat to set up factories to make paper clips, because that is the only goal that it knows. This would be analogous to a corporation that was set up to ensure that British people had access to nutmeg, but ended up setting up a brutal military colonial rule over hundreds of millions of people. And we have stories about this throughout history, the story of genies or the sorcerer's apprentice who call forth a spirit to bring about some good that you're interested in, but don't think about the consequences of what happens along the way. So we think about the Yangtze dolphin and the Carolina parakeet. Humans weren't trying to eat these species and weren't trying to eliminate them, but we killed them. We liked the dolphins, but cared more about having adequate electricity and factories to power the growth of our cities. We liked the parakeets, but we cared more about having land for our suburban subdivisions and chickens to provide eggs for us. We thought both of these species were pretty and even tried to save them, but this interest was no match for the accidental misalignment of our goals. If AI manages to become powerful in the world, and eventually as much more powerful than humans as humans are compared to other animals, then there's plenty of reason to suspect that something similar like this might happen to us. Regardless of whether or not AI ever intentionally turns on humanity, it doesn't need to want to eat us or turn us into batteries or do anything else. It might just accidentally damage us, just as corporations already have, and it might incidentally drive us extinct, the way that we did to various other species. Now, note that the primary sources of risk here depend on AI that has some sort of independent agency and some amount of generality. In ordinary English, an agent is someone who works for someone else and does something on their behalf. But the word entered the English language from philosophical discussions in Latin. In Latin, agere means to act, and an agent is just anything or anyone that is able to act on its own. In philosophical discussions of intelligence, whether it's artificial or natural, agency is used as the term for the capacity to take intentional and independent action. For the purposes of AI safety, agency is one of the core issues. The other core issue is generality, the ability to apply intelligence in novel ways to novel situations and take novel actions. So to think about how this might work, consider an AI system that plays chess. If the system just plays chess, then no matter how well it plays, it's unlikely to pose any sort of direct risk to humanity, unless you're a competitive chess player and that's your job. However, if the system has the ability to interact with the world in ways other than making moves in the chess game, it has some amount of agency, then we can imagine things going badly. Imagine that there's a competitive chess player who's discovered that they're sometimes limited in chess games by the amount of computing power that their chess system has available. And so what they do is they empower their chess system to take some amount of independent action. They give their chess computer a subroutine and a bank account that the computer can use to buy access to more cloud computing resources whenever it seems that those resources would be helpful for winning the chess game it's playing. And now, in order to use this budget efficiently, this chess playing AI may learn to evaluate the cost effectiveness of various providers of cloud computing services. And it may also learn that there are certain transactions it can engage in that actually give it more money to spend on cloud computing services than it had to begin with. And by experimenting with this bank account in between games, maybe the system learns how to extract a profit. To the machine, this profit is only relevant because it knows that more money in the bank account means the ability to buy more cloud computing resources and win more chess games. And so if it can spend limited amounts of computing resources to raise enough profit to buy more computing resources than it's spending, then it may start seeking this as an important method to achieve its primary goal of winning chess games. The details of what sorts of transactions it has the ability to engage in may limit or enhance the sorts of danger it might pose. But as we've learned from the history of corporations, once there's a being that is motivated to seek profit without having any specific human concerns, it can start to get dangerous. Current language models or recommendation systems or image generators or hiring systems don't have goals beyond matching their training data on the individual prompt. But they likely develop some sort of sophisticated representation of parts of the world that are relevant to doing their job effectively. Language models can tell us many facts about the world because that's important to predicting words. And this might give them significant capacities if they're put into an agential system, as some people might do, in order for them to make more effective use of this system. There's been worry about specifically malevolent or violent artificial intelligence systems, at least since Frankenstein, and certainly since movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey or Terminator or The Matrix. But the broader worry about the dangers of existential risk from misaligned systems, so misaligned systems rather than malevolent systems, is more recent. Some of the first significant discussion of existential risk from artificial intelligence in this general sense came in Nick Bostrom's 2002 paper, where he identified artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, nuclear weapons, and pandemics, particularly ones enhanced by biotechnology, as the major sources of truly existential risk to worry about. Natural sources, like volcanoes and meteors, he argues, these are infrequent enough. We can tell that they only occur once on the order of every tens of millions of years, that they're not likely to be as worrying as the kinds of risks that we may have made more likely through our technological development. few years later, the researcher Eliezer Yudkowsky was worrying about this and succeeded in raising money from donors to found a nonprofit, which was eventually known as the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, which is devoting to theorizing about the way that agential general AI systems might be aligned with humanity in such a way that their abilities wouldn't pose a risk to us. Though this institute has primarily been focusing on theoretical issues. But then in the early 2010s, neural net systems like AlexNet and the new Google translation system were suddenly outperforming competitors by huge amounts while becoming much harder to understand. And so this made many of the donors that founded MIRI become significantly enough worried that they wanted to set up a nonprofit with sufficient funding to actually conduct AI research itself, rather than just theorizing about agency. And in 2015, many of the researchers came together at a conference in Puerto Rico, and they drafted and signed a letter warning about the growing risks from artificial intelligence. And soon after, the donors came together and raised $1 billion to found a nonprofit organization that would actually engage in as much AI research as the for-profit companies. And they even hired many of the early pioneers of neural net research, including Ilya Sutskever, one of the creators of AlexNet. Because of the idea that this would be a nonprofit research center on AI dedicated to developing well-aligned, safe, and beneficial autonomous AI in the public interest rather than for private profit, they called this nonprofit organization OpenAI. The co-chairs of this nonprofit at the time were Elon Musk and Sam Altman. And a few years later, in 2017, the organizers of the 2015 Open Letter organized another conference about AI safety. This time they did it at the Asilomar Conference Center in Monterey, which is historically known as the site where, in the 1970s, biotechnologists came together to propose global regulations on the use of recombinant DNA and cloning to intentionally shape human life, even though that technology was not yet available. And in 2010, climate scientists met at this same site to propose global regulations on the use of geoengineering technology to intentionally shape the Earth's climate. Again, even though this was not yet available. And so AI researchers were coming together in the same place to make the same sorts of proposal. Okay, then over the next few years, it was unclear whether OpenAI was succeeding in keeping up with Google and the other private companies that were doing AI research. And so in 2018, Elon Musk left OpenAI. Musk says it was because of growing conflict of interest between the AI research done at OpenAI and the research done at his own private corporation, the car company Tesla. But Sam Altman claims that it was because Elon Musk wanted OpenAI to speed up its research, even if it raised new worries about safety. There are some difficulties with being an AI research organization that thinks that AI research poses risks to safety, but the idea was they want to be the first to have the powerful systems so that they can be more well aligned. Regardless, in 2019, OpenAI decided that despite the billions of dollars in funding it had so far, it still didn't have enough resources to keep up with the private corporations. And so it changed its model from being a nonprofit organization to being a capped profit organization. The idea was that investors would be able to get up to 100 times their initial money back, but no more. And this would enable enough profit for them to raise future investments from investors, but it would prevent the kind of focus on unchecked profit that they think leads to much of the existential risk. And this coincided with an investment of another $1 billion in OpenAI, this time from Microsoft rather than from donors. An important part of the structure was that the nonprofit board of directors would still retain the ability to remove the CEO at any point if they determined that the CEO's actions were undermining safety in pursuit of profit. Now, soon after this, in early 2020, OpenAI announced GPT-3, the next generation of their language model, and with it, they released their first revenue model. They provide paid access to GPT-3 for other companies who wanted to use it for whatever their applications were. Now, several of their employees decided that this sort of use was too risky and they decided that OpenAI seemed to be no longer sufficiently committed to the cause of AI safety. So several of these employees left and founded a new public benefit corporation that they wanted to do exactly what OpenAI had been intended to do. That is to keep up with the others in terms of research, but do so with a focus on safety rather than a focus on profit. And they called their organization Anthropic, using the Greek word for humanity. Then the next year in 2022, that's the year that the general public started noticing the massive advances of artificial intelligence that had been going on the previous couple of years. In that year, DALL-E, Midjourney, and eventually ChatGPT became available to the public and caused this spurt of interest. These systems are not agential and they're not fully general, but they do have a lot more capacity, and it's easy to see how they could be used by agential systems. Then soon after this, in early 2023, Microsoft stepped up their investment in OpenAI even further, getting 49% share in the supposedly capped profit corporation. OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google all released the next generation of their language models, and researchers from Microsoft published a paper claiming that actually this generation of systems, GPT-4, was demonstrating some of the planning skills of general intelligence. A lot of people think that this paper is basically just hype by Microsoft for the company that they're heavily invested in, but others think there's something to worry about here. And so in May of 2023, this statement that I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture was released, and it was signed by top researchers at OpenAI and Anthropic, many of the leaders of AI research at Microsoft and Google, as well as academics and people working on other global risks. Notably, no one from Amazon or Meta was involved in this. That summer, OpenAI specifically announced that many of their top researchers, including Ilya Sutskever, would dedicate their time and a fifth of the company's overall resources specifically to the problem of safety and alignment to get back to their original goal. But a few months later, all these commitments started to falter. Anthropic made a deal with Amazon for billions of dollars of investment, trying to keep up with OpenAI, bringing Anthropic also closer to the profit motive. And then in November, there were major headlines when the board of OpenAI triggered their clause, removing the CEO, Sam Altman. The official statement from the board was that Sam Altman had been deceptive in his interactions with the board. They didn't say about what, but unofficial rumors suggested that it was related to a product that they're working on called Q-Star that apparently doesn't just enable language model, but also true logical and mathematical reasoning with some amount of agential behavior. Other rumors have suggested that it was related to mistreatment of employees who were concerned with safety who wanted to blow the whistle on things, including Ilya Sutskever. At any rate, this was supposed to be where the nonprofit takes control of the company and keeps it aligned with safety. But in the next couple days, Microsoft offered to hire Sam Altman and also a large number of the researchers and engineers from OpenAI, effectively recreating the full AI research team of OpenAI within the fully for-profit corporation. And once it was clear that this could happen, the board of OpenAI relented. They were all replaced. Sam Altman was reinstated as CEO. And now it was clear that the nonprofit control system was not working. Over the next several months, several of these safety-minded employees left, including Ilya Sutskever. We don't yet know where this is all going, but we can see that even though both OpenAI and Anthropic were founded with the specific intention of avoiding the incentive structures that might lead to runaway agential AI, the incentive structures of being in this world at all seem to continually push them to do things that go against their safety-related aims. They haven't yet released agential and general AI that leads to risks, but they do keep pushing their models to do new things. There's been a parallel movement on the government side. In October of 2023, the Biden administration issued an executive order regarding powerful AI systems. The EU passed a law around that time that just went into effect at the beginning of August 2024. And there's a parallel bill that was proposed in the California legislature in the spring of 2024. As I record this video at the beginning of September 2024, the bill just a couple days ago was passed by both houses of the legislature. It hasn't yet been signed by the governor, and there's been pressure on both sides, both for and against him signing it. We don't yet know whether he will sign it and put it into effect or veto it. All of these regulations have a similar sort of form. They reiterate that relatively low impact AI systems can continue to proceed, but they ban a few specific types of AI system that haven't yet been implemented that would seem to pose direct dangers. Things like human manipulation or facial recognition in the public or social scoring. They also propose some sort of threshold of power for an AI system, such that any AI system above that power needs approval from a government agency before it can be released. Now, the EU threshold is just below the size of the current systems. The California threshold would be the next generation of the most powerful systems. And importantly, all of these regulations also make it clear that if an AI system somehow causes mass casualties or major damage up to $500 million, or leads to the creation of biological and nuclear weapons, then the company that made the AI system is liable, even if this happened as a result of some user trying to hack with the system and getting past some safety requirements. Under current law, it's clear that manufacturers of most products bear liability for certain kinds of bad outcomes that their product might cause. A car that explodes or a drug that causes long-lasting harms clearly results in liability for the manufacturer. Now, there are certain liability protections for online services. Search engines are not liable for harms caused by users finding information about how to create a bomb. Most search engines try to prevent that anyway because they think that's a good thing, but they aren't legally required to. Similarly, social media agencies are not liable for false claims that are posted by users. They do often try to regulate other sorts of claims, even though they're not legally liable, but part of this is probably to try to avoid the legal liability. However, these regulations make clear and make explicit that an AI company would be liable for certain kinds of harms, regardless of what they tried to do to stop it, if their attempts were not sufficient. The point about the powerful models is that there's a separate set of regulation that kicks in only for the biggest systems, requiring something more like the drug discovery process than the ordinary consumer good process. Rather than allowing a company to release a product and then sue them for harm if it happens, it requires the company to first prove to a government regulator that it won't cause the harm before it gets released. And the idea is that since these AI systems might be powerful enough to trigger potential very large harms, we want to prevent those before they happen rather than afterwards. Now, many critics of this regulation have said this will just drive AI innovation out of the state of California, out of Europe, into other places where there are fewer controls. And there have been two very different strands of criticism of the AI safety movement. And both of these strands argue that, primarily, that the risk of existential harm from AI has been overhyped. However, one set of critics argues that the fact that the risk is overhyped means that research and commercial development should just proceed faster without intrusive regulation because AI can produce enough good in the world that they think we shouldn't worry so much about these potential harms. But the other set of critics argues that the focus on existential risk being overhyped means that we're failing to pay proper attention to the more mundane harms that AI causes in terms of entrenching bias or increasing the concentration of profits in a few large corporations, increased use of energy and other resources, intellectual property theft, and so on. Although most of the major early researchers in artificial intelligence have been very concerned with AI safety, people like Geoff Hinton and Yoshua Bengio and Ilya Sutskever, there is a notable minority who have not, including Yann LeCun, who is the designer of the first successful neural net for recognizing handwritten digits, and who's currently leading AI research for Meta. And they've been making their large language model, Llama, available open source, whereas the others have been keeping it in-house. Many people think that Meta making their system open source increases risk hugely. Andrew Ng, who ran Google Brain from 2011 to 2014 and ran the Chinese company Baidu's AI Center from 2014 to 2017, he also founded Coursera, the massive online education platform at Stanford, and taught an AI class to hundreds of thousands of students online. He's prominently stated that worrying about existential risk from AI is like worrying about overpopulation on Mars. And he thinks that AI should develop further before we take any precautions of this sort. Now, the people in the AI safety world have thought this is like saying we shouldn't worry about carbon emissions until after they've happened. And they want to take efforts before it happens. Now, the critics on the other side include people like Timnit Gebru, who used to run the AI Ethics Center at Google until she was fired for publishing a paper that they didn't approve. She was discussing lots of the present concerns about AI, like energy use, data use, bias, and the like. And another person who's been prominent in trying to shift attention from long-term large risks to short-term ethical issues is Gary Marcus. He's a cognitive scientist that founded a few AI companies in the 2000s, and he argues that the present focus on neural nets and large language models is unlikely to produce true intelligence, but will produce a lot of bias and energy consumption. Now, it remains to be seen which of these three groups, the ethics group, the safety group, or the others like LeCun and Ng, who are not worried at all, which of these groups will play a larger role in shaping the development and regulation of AI. The people who are most concerned with safety happen to also be the ones with the most institutional incentives to proceed with the work despite the risk, as we've seen with OpenAI and Anthropic repeatedly doing things that go against their stated goals. We will see how all of this turns out.